Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Samuel was a 45-year-old mechanic who had lived his entire life in the remote Alaskan village of Kivalina. The population never exceeded 200 souls, and everyone knew everyone else's business. The village sat on a narrow barrier island, surrounded by the Chukchi Sea on one side and a lagoon on the other, with the nearest road system more than 60 miles away, across the frozen tundra before the spring thaw of 2018. Samuel needed this story to be recorded because he wanted people to understand how isolation and the long darkness of Arctic winters can transform a man into something unrecognizable, and how a community's trust can become a weapon against the innocent. Samuel had grown up in Kivalina learning the trade from his father, who had learned it from his grandfather. In a village where an equipment failure could mean the difference between life and death during the brutal winters, a good mechanic was worth his weight in gold. Samuel repaired snowmobiles, generators, boat engines, and anything else that had a motor. He was the kind of man people called at 2 in the morning when the heating system failed and the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. He had never married. He was content with his work and with his place within the community. His small house near the edge of the village was filled with tools and spare parts, but to him it was his sanctuary. He knew every family in Kivalina. He had repaired their machines, shared meals with them, mourned their losses, and celebrated their triumphs. In October 2017, a man named Marcus arrived on the weekly small plane flight from Kotzebue. He was in his early 30s, white, with a rough beard and hands that looked as if they had been through hard labor. Marcus had been hired by the fish processing cooperative, which operated during the summer months but needed maintenance year-round. The cooperative had been trying for years to hire local people, but most young people left for larger towns, and those who stayed had other responsibilities. Marcus arrived with references from processing plants on the islands of the Bering Sea, and he seemed enthusiastic about the job despite the isolation. The cooperative manager, a man named Robert, who was also Samuel's cousin, vouched for Marcus and helped him settle into one of the small apartments above the cooperative building. Samuel met Marcus at the village store 3 days after his arrival. It was already dark at 4 in the afternoon, and the temperature had fallen below freezing. Marcus was struggling with a stubborn door on one of the cooperative's utility vehicles. His breath came out in white clouds as he cursed at the frozen metal. Samuel walked over and offered to help. Within minutes, he got the door working again, explaining to Marcus a few tricks for keeping machinery operational in Arctic conditions. Marcus was grateful and bought him a coffee at the store. They talked for an hour, and Samuel discovered that he liked the newcomer. Marcus asked good questions about how to survive the winter, about the community, and about the land. He seemed respectful and sincerely interested in making Kivalina his home. Over the following weeks, Samuel and Marcus developed a friendship. Samuel taught Marcus how to properly prepare equipment for the winter, how to keep generators running during blizzards, how to dress in layers, and how to watch for the signs of frostbite. Marcus helped Samuel on jobs that required 2 pairs of hands, and he proved to be someone who learned quickly. Samuel introduced him around the village, and Marcus made the effort to attend community meetings and learn basic phrases in Inupiaq. By November, when the sun disappeared below the horizon for the long polar night, Marcus seemed to be integrating into the very fabric of Kivalina. But then strange things began to happen. Small objects started disappearing from the homes in the village. A carving knife from one house, a necklace from another, a box of ammunition, a satellite phone. Nothing of enormous value, but personal items whose absence people noticed. In a community as small and close-knit as Kivalina, thefts were almost non-existent. Doors were rarely locked. People trusted one another because they had to. Surviving in such a harsh environment required cooperation and mutual support. The thefts created an atmosphere of suspicion and unease that was foreign to the village. Samuel first heard about the missing objects during a community meeting in late November. The darkness outside was absolute, and the wind howled against the walls of the community center. Several people stood up to report what had been taken from their homes. The elders looked worried. They said that in earlier times such behavior would have been dealt with quickly, because a person who stole from the community endangered everyone. Robert, the cooperative manager, suggested organizing a village watch and making sure everyone protected their belongings more carefully. There was general agreement, but Samuel could see the concern on people's faces. Something had changed in Kivalina, and no one knew how to fix it. Marcus attended that meeting, sitting silently at the back. Samuel noticed that he was taking notes, which struck him as strange, though he thought perhaps Marcus wanted to volunteer for watch shifts. After the meeting, Marcus approached Samuel and expressed his concern about the thefts. He said he hoped the village caught whoever was responsible, because it made him uncomfortable knowing there was a thief among them. Samuel agreed, though something in Marcus's tone seemed slightly off. He could not identify exactly what bothered him, so he dismissed it as simple paranoia caused by the situation. December arrived and the thefts continued despite the village watch. More objects disappeared, and the tension in Kivalina grew heavier and heavier. People began locking their doors for the first time in years. Neighbors who had been friends for decades started looking at each other with suspicion. The darkness and cold seemed to press down harder, and Samuel noticed that people no longer gathered as much in the evenings. The social fabric of the village was wearing thin, and he felt powerless to stop it. Then in mid-December, everything changed for Samuel. One night he came home after working on a generator at the school and found Robert and 2 other members of the village council waiting outside for him. The temperature was 30 below zero, and their faces were serious. Robert explained that several people had raised concerns about Samuel. He had been seen near their homes around the times when objects disappeared. One person claimed to have seen Samuel acting suspiciously near a window. Another said Samuel had been asking strange questions about what people kept in their homes. The evidence was circumstantial but troubling, and the council needed to search Samuel's house and workshop. Samuel stood in the freezing darkness, too stunned to speak. These were people he had known his entire life, people whose machines he had repaired countless times, whose children he had helped, whose trust he had believed was unbreakable. He tried to explain that he often walked through the village at unusual hours because he was frequently called for emergency repairs, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. The long darkness and the stress caused by the thefts had created an atmosphere in which reason was overwhelmed by fear and suspicion. He had no choice but to allow the search. They found nothing in his house, but in his workshop, inside a toolbox he almost never used, they discovered several of the missing objects: the carving knife, the necklace, the ammunition. Samuel stared at those objects in disbelief. He had never seen them before. He tried to explain that someone must have placed them there, but his protests sounded weak, even to his own ears. Why would anyone want to frame him? What possible motive could there be? The council members looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and anger. Robert, his own cousin, looked away without meeting his eyes. They confiscated the stolen objects and told Samuel that he had to remain in his house, except for essential movement, while they decided what to do. In a village without a police force and without an easy way to contact outside authorities during the winter, justice was handled internally. Samuel spent the following days in a kind of hell. He could not eat or sleep. He replayed every interaction he had had with people in the village, trying to understand how this had happened. He thought about Marcus, about how the newcomer had shown so much interest in his routines and work schedule. He remembered Marcus asking about different houses, about who lived where, about the layout of the village. At the time, it had seemed like normal curiosity from someone trying to get to know his new community. Now those questions took on a much darker meaning. On the 3rd day of his confinement, during a brief period when the wind died down, Samuel decided he had to investigate. If he wanted to clear his name, he would have to find proof himself. He waited until late when most people were already inside their homes and headed to the cooperative building where Marcus lived. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and the ice fog that sometimes forms in extreme cold floated in the air, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Samuel reached the building unseen and quietly climbed the exterior stairs to Marcus's apartment. The door was locked, but Samuel had helped install those locks when the apartments had been renovated years earlier. He knew their weaknesses. Using a thin piece of metal he carried in his pocket, He manipulated the mechanism and carefully opened the door. Inside, the apartment was warm and dimly lit by a single lamp. Marcus was not home. He was probably working late at the processing plant. Samuel moved quickly, checking drawers and closets with the practical efficiency of someone who knew how to find things in cluttered spaces. In the bedroom closet, beneath a loose floorboard, Samuel found a backpack. Inside were more missing objects from the village: tools, jewelry, personal documents, photographs. There was also a laptop, which seemed out of place among the other things. Samuel opened it and discovered that it had no password. What he found made his blood run cold. Despite the warm air in the apartment, Marcus had files documenting his time in Kivalina and in other remote villages in Alaska and northern Canada. He had a pattern. He would arrive in an isolated community, establish himself as a trusted member, and then begin a systematic campaign of theft and psychological manipulation. But the thefts were not about the value of the objects. They were about creating chaos and distrust. Marcus kept detailed notes about the social structures of each community, about who trusted whom, about the cracks that could be exploited. In Kivalina, he had identified Samuel as the perfect scapegoat because of his access to homes, his solitary nature, and his position of trust. There were photographs of other villages, of other victims who had been framed for Marcus's thefts. Some notes suggested that Marcus had managed to destroy the social cohesion of entire communities, turning neighbor against neighbor until the villages practically stopped functioning. He documented everything with a clinical distance that was deeply disturbing. There were also references to criminal charges he had fled from in the continental United States, to restraining orders and accusations of harassment. Marcus was a predator who had discovered that remote Alaskan villages were perfect hunting grounds because they were isolated, because they had limited access to police, and because their residents trusted one another out of necessity. Samuel photographed everything with his phone, his hands trembling from a mixture of fear and rage. He put the backpack back exactly as he had found it and left the apartment, making sure to lock the door behind him. Outside, the cold struck him like a physical force, but he barely noticed it. He went straight to Robert's house and pounded on the door until his cousin opened it. In Robert's warm kitchen, with Robert's wife and teenage son present as witnesses, Samuel showed them what he had found. He watched Robert's face change as he swiped through the photographs on Samuel's phone. He saw the exact moment when Robert understood that they had all been manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to exploit their trust and isolation. Robert immediately called an emergency council meeting, and within an hour, most of the village leadership had gathered. The decision was made to confront Marcus immediately. They could not risk him discovering that Samuel had found the evidence and escaping on the next plane. A group of men, including Samuel and Robert, went to the processing plant where Marcus was working the night shift. When they entered, Marcus looked up from the equipment he was repairing and instantly understood that something had changed. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The building was surrounded by men who knew the village perfectly, and outside there was nothing but frozen darkness and deadly cold. They took Marcus to the community center and showed him the evidence. At first he denied everything, but in the face of the photographs and Samuel's testimony, his denials began to sound less and less convincing. Finally, as the night went on and the entire village gathered to hear what had happened, Marcus's facade broke. He admitted to the thefts and admitted to framing Samuel, but he showed no remorse. Instead, he launched into a bitter tirade about how naive and trusting the people of Kivalina were, about how easy it had been to manipulate them, about how their isolation made them perfect victims. His words were chilling in their coldness and contempt. The village council contacted the Alaska State Troopers by satellite phone, but the nearest post was in Kotzebue, and weather conditions made it impossible for them to fly in for at least a week. The council decided to keep Marcus locked in a secured room in the community center, under constant watch, until the authorities could arrive. Samuel was publicly cleared of all suspicion, but the damage to the community had already been done. The trust that had held Kivalina together had been fractured, and repairing it would take time. When the troopers finally arrived and took Marcus into custody, the village learned more about his past. He had outstanding warrants in Washington and Oregon. He had been banned from several Alaska Native villages. The cooperative had not performed a proper background check and had trusted falsified references. Marcus was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to prison, but the sentence seemed insufficient compared to the psychological damage he had caused in several communities. Samuel never forgot that winter. The experience of being falsely accused by people he had known his entire life, of seeing his trust and reputation shattered, left scars that did not heal easily. He continued working as a mechanic, and over time the people of Kivalina rebuilt their relationships with one another and with him. But something had changed in the village. Doors remained locked. People became more cautious with newcomers. The innocence of their isolation had been compromised forever by Marcus's calculated cruelty. Samuel often thought about the other villages Marcus had destroyed and wondered whether they had recovered or whether the damage had been permanent. He learned that isolation could be a weakness as much as a strength, and that trust, once broken, was the hardest thing in the world to repair. In the long darkness of the Arctic winter, he learned that the coldest thing in Alaska was not the temperature, but the ability of some people to casually destroy everything good that exists in the world. Story 2. All of this happened 3 winters ago, when Arya was working as a temporary employee at a remote hunting lodge that could only be reached by small plane. To provide a little context, Arya was a 28-year-old woman originally from Washington State who had accepted the job to get away from the problems she had at home and experience the true wilderness of Alaska. She had gone through a difficult divorce and needed distance from everything familiar. The job listing promised adventure, good pay, and the kind of solitude that could help a person reset their life. What it did not mention was that isolation could become a prison, and that being cut off from civilization also meant being cut off from help. The lodge was called Denali Ridge Outfitters, although it was nowhere near Denali. It was located at mile 147 of an old abandoned mining road that had not been maintained in decades. The road was impassable for most of the year, warped by permafrost heave and slowly being reclaimed by nature. The only reliable access was by float plane in the summer or by ski plane in the winter. The lodge served wealthy hunters who paid high prices for guided expeditions in search of moose, caribou, and occasionally grizzly bears. During the peak season from August to October, the place employed a dozen guides, cooks, and support staff. But in the off-season, only a minimal crew remained to maintain the property and prepare it for the following year. Arya arrived in late October, just as the last hunting clients were leaving and the lakes were beginning to freeze. The owner, a man named Gerald Hutchkins, picked her up personally in his Super Cub. Gerald was in his early 60s, weathered thin, and carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades in the wilderness. He had built the lodge with his own hands 30 years earlier, and had a reputation as one of the best hunting guides in the state. During the flight, he pointed out landmarks and told her stories about successful hunts and dangerous encounters with wildlife. Arya found him charming and full of knowledge, exactly the kind of Alaskan character she had expected to meet. The lodge itself was impressive, a massive log structure with soaring ceilings and hunting trophies covering the walls. There was a commercial kitchen, a large common room with a stone fireplace, and individual guest cabins scattered around the main building. Electricity came from solar panels and a diesel generator, and water was drawn from a well. During the winter, the staff would consist of only 4 people: Gerald, Arya, and 2 men named Tom and Steve, who were responsible for maintenance and firewood. Tom and Steve lived in a cabin located about a quarter mile from the main lodge, while Arya had a small room in the staff wing of the main building. Gerald had his own quarters on the opposite side. The first few weeks went smoothly. Arya's work consisted of deep cleaning the guest cabins, organizing supplies, updating the reservation system, and helping prepare meals. Tom and Steve were friendly, although they mostly kept to themselves, working long days cutting and splitting firewood for the winter. Gerald was an attentive employer. He made sure Arya had everything she needed and taught her about the systems that kept the lodge running. He shared meals with the staff and told stories from his years in Alaska. close encounters with bears, rescues of stranded hunters, and the challenges of building a business in such a remote place. But Arya began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. Gerald paid particular attention to her during meals, asking personal questions about her divorce and about the reasons she had left Washington. At first, she thought he was simply trying to be kind, making conversation to break up the monotony of winter. But his questions became more insistent, more focused on her emotional vulnerabilities. He asked about her relationship with her ex-husband, whether she felt lonely, and what she hoped to find in Alaska. Arya tried to redirect the conversation with vague answers, but Gerald seemed to interpret her reserve as a challenge. He also began finding reasons for them to work together on different projects. He needed help inventorying the trophy room. He wanted her opinion on rearranging the furniture in the great room. He asked her to assist him with the generator maintenance, saying he wanted her to know how everything worked in case of an emergency. During those moments, he stood closer than necessary, touched her arm or shoulder while explaining something, and held eye contact a fraction of a second longer than normal. Arya recognized the pattern from her marriage. The slow erosion of boundaries disguised as mentorship or friendship. In early November, Tom and Steve flew to Fairbanks to buy supplies and visit their families before winter fully settled in. They would be gone for 10 days. Gerald assured Arya that this was routine, that they always made a supply trip at the beginning of winter, and that he and she could manage the lodge without any problem. But when the plane disappeared over the horizon, Arya felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She was alone with Gerald in a place inaccessible by road, where the radio was the only link to the outside world, and where the nearest neighbor was more than 50 miles away. The first night alone, Gerald opened a bottle of expensive whiskey and invited Arya to join him by the fire. She politely declined, saying she was tired from the day's work. He did not insist, but she saw something cross his face, a momentary tension around the eyes. Arya went to her room and locked the door, something she had not felt the need to do before. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the lodge settling and the wind blowing outside. The next morning, Gerald's attitude had changed. He was not openly hostile, but the friendly charm had evaporated. He spoke to her in short phrases, giving orders instead of making requests. When she asked what tasks were planned for the day, he told her they would work together preparing the guest cabins for winter. They spent the day going from cabin to cabin, draining pipes and shutting off the water supply. Gerald used the time to tell her stories, but those stories were different from the ones before. They were stories about hunters who had violated hunting laws, about men who had gotten away with things in the wilderness that would have sent them to prison anywhere else. He spoke of Alaska as the last place where a person could truly live by their own rules, where the weakness of civilization did not apply. One story in particular chilled Arya. Gerald described a hunter who had accidentally shot and killed another member of his group. According to Gerald, the man simply buried the body in a remote location and reported that his companion had wandered off and gotten lost. The body was never found. No charges were filed, and the man continued hunting in Alaska for years. Gerald told the story in a casual tone that suggested a certain admiration for the hunter's ruthlessness. Arya asked him whether the story was true, and Gerald smiled before answering that, in Alaska, the truth was whatever you could make other people believe. That night, Arya tried to use the satellite phone to call her sister in Seattle, but discovered that the phone did not work. She checked the equipment and found that the battery had been removed. She went to Gerald's office to ask him about it, and he told her he had taken the battery out to preserve its life in case of an emergency. He added that he would reinstall it if she needed to make a call, but he wanted to know whom she would call and why. The implication was clear. Her communication with the outside world now depended on his permission. Arya understood that she was in serious danger. She considered her options carefully. Tom and Steve would not return for another 8 days. Even if she managed to get the radio working, asking for help would mean admitting her suspicions, which were based on implications and uncomfortable feelings more than direct threats. And if she was wrong, if Gerald was simply socially awkward and she was overreacting because of the trauma of her divorce, She would lose her job and her reputation in the small world of Alaska hunting lodges. But her instincts, sharpened by years of dealing with a controlling marriage, told her that Gerald was testing her, pushing boundaries to see how far he could go. So she began to prepare. She packed a small emergency bag with warm clothing, food, and the few survival supplies she could access without raising suspicion. She studied the maps in Gerald's office when he was outside, taking note of the locations of the nearest communities and airstrips. She tested the radio late one night and confirmed that it worked, which meant that her only reliable means of communication was under Gerald's control. She also began noticing things around the lodge that she had previously overlooked. There were locks placed on the outside of some storage rooms. In one of the equipment sheds, she found straps and restraint mechanisms that Gerald had said were used for handling injured animals, though they seemed excessive for that purpose. And hidden inside a filing cabinet, she found a folder with photographs of former female employees, women whose expressions in the images ranged from discomfort to fear. On the fifth night alone with Gerald, he came to her room. It was late, past midnight, and Arya was not asleep. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. She heard him stop in front of her door. The handle turned slowly, testing the lock. Arya had placed a chair under the handle as an extra barrier, and she heard Gerald's quiet curse when the door did not open. He knocked softly and asked if she was awake. Arya did not answer. She controlled her breathing and pretended to be asleep. After a long moment, she heard Gerald walk away. The next morning, Gerald was furious. He accused her of being ungrateful for the opportunity he had given her, of being cold and unfriendly, of not appreciating the hospitality he had offered. His voice rose as he spoke, and Arya saw the mask finally fall away. He was not a lonely man awkwardly looking for companionship. He was a predator who felt entitled to get what he wanted and was enraged by being rejected. She apologized, trying to calm the situation, but her words only seemed to anger him more. Gerald slammed his hand on the table and told her that she was in his lodge, in his world, and that she needed to understand how things worked out there. Arya made a decision. She told Gerald that she needed to check something in one of the guest cabins and left the main building. Once outside, she went straight to the equipment shed and gathered supplies. She took a radio, a flare gun, extra batteries, and a heavy coat. She knew that if she stayed, the situation would escalate. Gerald's behavior indicated that he had done this before, that the photographs in the filing cabinet represented a pattern, and that her isolation was not accidental, but constructed. She thought about trying to leave on foot by following the old mining road toward the highway, 50 miles away. But it was November in Alaska, with temperatures dropping well below freezing at night and very few hours of daylight. She would not survive the journey on foot, especially if Gerald decided to pursue her on his snowmobile. Her only real option was to reach the radio, call for help, and then find a place to hide until someone arrived. She headed to one of the farthest guest cabins, one she knew had a wood stove and enough supplies. She barricaded herself inside and used the portable radio to call for help. She managed to contact a flight service in Fairbanks and explained her situation, trying to sound calm and rational despite her fear. The operator took her seriously and promised to send someone as soon as the weather allowed. But a storm system was approaching, and flights to the lodge could be impossible for several days. Arya would have to wait. Gerald discovered her absence in less than an hour. She heard his snowmobile moving across the property, heard him shouting her name. His tone went from concerned to furious and then to threatening. He knew she had taken the radio. He shouted that she was being a fool, that she would freeze if she tried to run, that he owned every building on the property, and that she had nowhere to go. Arya remained silent inside the cabin, keeping the fire in the stove low so the smoke would not give away her location. The standoff lasted almost 2 days. Arya rationed her food and kept the cabin warm enough to survive, but not comfortable. She listened to Gerald moving occasionally around the area, checking different cabins. On the second day, Tom and Steve returned early from Fairbanks, brought back by the pilot from the flight service whom the operator had contacted. They confronted Gerald, and Arya heard the argument from her hiding place. Tom and Steve had known Gerald for years, but they had never seen that side of him. They had heard rumors about previous female employees leaving suddenly, but Gerald had always claimed they simply had not been able to handle the isolation. Now, faced with the evidence of his predatory behavior, they were shocked and furious. The pilot who brought Tom and Steve back remained at the lodge both to evacuate Arya and to serve as a witness. When Arya finally came out of the cabin, she was exhausted but relieved. Gerald tried to claim that she was mentally unstable, that the isolation had affected her judgment. But the pilot and the returning staff did not believe him. They had seen too many warning signs, and Tom admitted that he had always felt uncomfortable with the way Gerald interacted with female employees. Arya left on the next flight. She filed a report with the Alaska State Troopers, but the case was complicated because of the remote location and the lack of physical evidence of an assault. Gerald had been careful, never crossing certain lines, always maintaining plausible deniability. The investigation revealed that at least 4 previous female employees had left suddenly under similar circumstances, but none had filed formal complaints. Over time, Gerald lost his business, not because of legal consequences, but because of the damage to his reputation. Word spread through the small world of Alaska hunting lodges, and clients stopped booking with him. Arya returned to Washington State, but she stayed in contact with Tom and Steve. They told her that Gerald had sold the lodge and disappeared, possibly to another remote area where he could start over with another identity and new victims. That knowledge haunted her. She had escaped, but others might not be so lucky. The isolation that had drawn her to Alaska, the promise of running from her problems and finding peace in the solitude of the wilderness, had almost destroyed her. She learned that isolation was a double-edged weapon, that the absence of civilization also meant the absence of protection, and that predators understood that better than anyone. To this day, she does not know whether Gerald ever truly harmed previous employees or whether she was the first to successfully resist him. The uncertainty, the knowledge that she had been completely vulnerable and that help was days away, changed the way she saw the world. She was no longer the person who believed that escape could solve problems. She had learned that some dangers follow you, and others wait for you in the places you run to, patient and calculating. Story 3. It all began in October 2019, when David was a junior at the small high school in Haines, a town of 800 people tucked between the mountains and the sea in southeastern Alaska. David had lived in Haines his entire life and knew every road, trail, and shortcut in the area. He was comfortable in the wilderness, having grown up hunting and fishing with his father and uncles. The darkness, the isolation of Alaska, and the winter did not bother him. He had driven the same route home from school hundreds of times, first along the Haines Highway and then onto Creek Road, a narrow gravel road that led to his family's property 3 miles outside town. The road passed through dense forest of spruce and hemlock, with mountains rising steeply on one side and a creek running parallel on the other. During the school year, David often made that drive in total darkness, and he had never felt afraid. That changed on a Tuesday night in mid-October. David left school around 6 after staying late for basketball practice. It was already dark, and a light rain was falling, typical for autumn in southeastern Alaska. The road was empty, and David had music playing as he drove. When he turned onto Creek Road, his headlights cutting through the darkness and mist, he was thinking about his homework and an upcoming game. He was not paying any special attention to his surroundings until something enormous crossed the road in front of him. David slammed on the brakes and his truck skidded slightly on the wet gravel. Whatever had crossed was gigantic, much larger than a moose or a bear. It moved with a strange gait, not quite like any animal David knew. He sat in the truck with the engine running, staring at the spot where the thing had vanished into the trees. His first thought was that it must have been a moose, that the darkness and rain had distorted his perception of its size and movement. But moose were common in the area, and David had seen hundreds of them. This had been different. He continued home slowly, watching the forest on both sides of the road. His heart was beating faster than normal, and he felt an unfamiliar unease. When he arrived home, he did not mention the incident to his parents, partly because he was not sure what he had seen, and partly because he did not want them to think he was talking nonsense. That night he went to bed, but he had trouble sleeping. His mind replayed the moment the thing had crossed in front of his headlights again and again. 3 nights later, David saw it again. This time he was prepared, or at least he thought he was. He was driving back from a friend's house around 10 at night. As he took the curves of Creek Road, his headlights illuminated something standing at the edge of the tree line. David slowed down and got a better look at it. The creature was upright on 2 legs, at least 8 feet tall, with a massive body covered in dark hair or fur. Its eyes reflected the headlights with a greenish shine. For several seconds, David and the creature stared at each other through the rain. Then the thing turned and walked into the forest with a fluid, deliberate movement, clearly not human and unlike any bear David had ever seen. This time, David was deeply shaken. He drove home faster than was safe on that gravel road and went straight to his father. He described what he had seen, expecting skepticism or concern about his mental state. Instead, his father listened silently and then asked specific questions about the creature's size, the way it walked, and the exact location of the sighting. When David finished, his father was quiet for a long moment before telling him to avoid driving alone on that road at night for a while. He did not dismiss David's account, but he did not offer any explanation for what he had seen either. David began cautiously asking people he trusted. He discovered that Creek Road had something of a reputation among some older residents. People claimed to have seen strange things in that area for decades, though most were reluctant to talk about it openly. One of his teachers, a man who had lived in Haines for 40 years, told him privately that the Tlingit, the indigenous people of the area, had stories about certain parts of the forest where humans should not go, places where things existed that were older and stranger than bears or wolves. The teacher did not say he believed those stories, but he did not reject them either. David tried to follow his father's advice and avoid the road at night, but his family lived at the end of that same road, and sometimes driving at night was unavoidable. Over the following weeks, he saw the creature 3 more times. Each sighting was brief but clear. The thing seemed to be watching the road, appearing at different points, though always within the same 3-mile stretch. David noticed that his dog, normally brave and fearless, a large husky mix, refused to get out of the truck when they were on that road after dark. The animal whimpered and pressed against David, ears flattened back, which was completely out of character for him. David's friend Marcus finally agreed to ride the road with him one evening in early November. Marcus was skeptical about the whole thing and had joked about David's overactive imagination. They drove slowly along Creek Road just after sunset, both watching the forest. For the first 2 miles, nothing happened, and David could feel Marcus's impatience. Then as they rounded a curve near the 2-mile marker, they both saw it. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, directly in their path. David stopped the truck about 30 yards away. In the headlights, the thing was clearly visible. It was enormous, much larger than any bear David had ever seen, fully upright, with arms hanging almost to its knees. Its face was difficult to distinguish in detail, but David had the impression of looking at something that was not fully human and not fully animal. The creature made no sound. It did not threaten them. It simply stood there, as if asserting its presence. Then, with shocking speed, it advanced toward the truck. David immediately shifted into reverse and backed up at full speed, nearly losing control on the narrow road. When he looked forward again, the creature had disappeared into the forest. Marcus was pale and silent. When they reached David's house, Marcus said he needed to go home immediately. He never spoke about what they had seen, and when David tried to mention it afterward, Marcus changed the subject. But David noticed that Marcus stopped making jokes about his imagination and started taking a different route whenever he had to visit David's family. The sightings continued throughout the winter. David saw the creature at least a dozen more times over the following months, always in the same general area, always at night or during the dim light of winter evenings. Sometimes he saw it in the distance, moving through the trees parallel to the road. Other times it was closer, standing still, watching as David passed in the truck. He developed a routine for driving through that stretch as fast as safety allowed, never stopping, never staying there longer than necessary. His dog's reaction became even more extreme. The animal refused to eat before trips on that road and trembled uncontrollably every time they approached the area. In February, David came home after basketball practice and found tracks in the snow around his family's property. The footprints were enormous, at least 18 inches long, with a structure similar to a human foot, but much larger and with the visible claw marks. The tracks circled the house, approached the windows, and then led toward the tree line, where they disappeared. David's father photographed the tracks and reported them to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, saying they were unusual bear tracks. An officer came out and examined them, but he seemed confused. He said they did not match any bear tracks he knew, though he offered no alternative explanation. That night, David heard something walking around outside the house. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and stopped directly in front of his bedroom window. He could hear deep, slow breathing on the other side of the glass. His dog was in the room with him, hiding under the bed, whimpering. David stayed completely still, not daring to look toward the window, terrified of what he might see if he did. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away. The next morning, there were fresh tracks in the snow, and several large branches had been torn from the trees near the house, something that would have required tremendous strength. David's parents finally accepted that they had to take the situation seriously. His father contacted some elders from the Tlingit community and asked for advice. They performed a ceremony on the property, though they did not explain to David exactly what it involved or what it was supposed to accomplish. They told David's family that they had been living in a place where they were not alone, where something ancient had a territory that included their land, and that respect and caution were necessary. After the ceremony, the direct approaches to the house stopped, but David continued seeing the creature on Creek Road. It was always there, watching, like a presence that had claimed that stretch of forest as its own. David graduated from high school that spring and left Haines to attend college in Anchorage. He felt relieved to leave, though also guilty for leaving his parents on that isolated property. Eventually, his parents sold the land and moved closer to town, though they never explained their decision to relatives who asked. David is now 23 years old and lives in Anchorage, where he works as a surveyor for a natural resources company. His job sometimes takes him into remote areas, and he has learned to trust his instincts when a place feels wrong, when the wilderness seems to be watching. He has researched similar sightings in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest and discovered that his experience is far from unique. There are hundreds, even thousands, of reports of encounters with creatures that do not fit into accepted categories of wildlife. Most people who experience these things do not speak about them publicly for fear of ridicule or disbelief. David's encounter on Creek Road taught him that the wilderness of Alaska holds things science has not cataloged, things indigenous peoples have known about for thousands of years, but that Western culture dismisses as myth or superstition. He learned that there are boundaries in the natural world that human beings cross at their own risk, and that the safety of civilization disappears quickly when one faces something genuinely unknown. David warns anyone who asks him that Alaska is not only beautiful and dangerous in the conventional sense of weather and wild animals. There are also places and things that defy all explanation, and some mysteries are better left alone. Story 4. Evelyn is currently a licensed bush pilot, dedicated to transporting supplies to villages scattered across northern Alaska. She has been flying these routes for 6 years, and she knows the landscape as well as anyone can come to know it. The rivers, the mountains, the small clusters of buildings that form villages where a few dozen or a few hundred people build their lives under conditions most Americans could not imagine. She flies out of Kotzebue, a central city of approximately 3,000 people located on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. From there, her routes take her to places like Noatak, Kiana, Salawik, and dozens of smaller settlements. She transports mail, medicine, food, fuel, and from time to time, passengers. Her Cessna 206 is equipped with both wheels and skis, allowing her to land on gravel strips during the summer and on frozen lakes in the winter. The work is demanding and dangerous, with weather that can turn deadly in a matter of minutes. But Evelyn loves it. She feels most alive when she is alone in her plane, navigating by landmarks and instinct, carrying supplies that people depend on to survive. In March 2023, something happened that Evelyn still cannot explain. She was flying her usual route from Kotzebue to Noatak, a village of about 500 people located approximately 50 miles inland. The weather was clear and visibility was good, which was a blessing in late winter, when storms could cut villages off for days. She had flown that route hundreds of times and could have navigated it almost in her sleep. Her radio was tuned to the standard aviation frequency, monitoring traffic and weather reports. Halfway to Noatak, she heard something strange over the radio. A voice distorted by static but clearly human was asking for help. The transmission was weak and intermittent, though Evelyn managed to understand enough to realize that someone was in danger. The voice was male, sounded terrified, and spoke English with what seemed like an accent from the middle of the previous century. He said his plane had crashed, that he was injured, and that he needed rescue immediately. The man provided coordinates which Evelyn quickly wrote down on the kneeboard she carried. The coordinates placed the crash site about 20 miles north of her current position, in an area of tundra and small lakes. Evelyn tried to respond. She asked for more information, requested that the pilot repeat his location, and asked him to describe his condition. But her transmissions did not seem to be heard. The distressed pilot kept asking for help, repeating the same information as if he could not hear anyone trying to communicate with him. Evelyn made a decision. She diverted from her route and headed toward the coordinates. If someone had crashed and survived, time was crucial. In the March cold, exposure could kill within hours. She climbed to get a better view of the terrain and began searching for any sign of a downed aircraft. The coordinates led her to a series of small frozen lakes surrounded by low hills. She flew over the area several times, low and slow, looking for wreckage, any disturbance in the snow, smoke, or any sign of human presence. She saw nothing. The landscape was intact and empty, with no trace of a crash. She tried contacting the distressed pilot again, but by then the transmission had stopped completely. Her radio remained silent, except for normal traffic from other pilots and air traffic control. Evelyn expanded the search pattern, thinking that perhaps the pilot's coordinates had been imprecise because of stress or injury. She spent another 30 minutes scanning the area before her fuel reserves forced her to continue on to Noatak. As soon as she landed, she reported the incident to the authorities, providing the coordinates and describing what she had heard. The Alaska State Troopers and the Civil Air Patrol were notified, and a search was organized. The search found nothing. There was no impact site, no aircraft wreckage, no emergency locator beacon signal, no tracks, and no evidence that any aircraft had recently been in that area. Evelyn was interviewed in detail and provided every piece of information she could remember. The authorities reviewed missing aircraft records and found no reports that matched the time period or the location. They suggested that Evelyn might have heard some old recording transmitted somehow, or that certain atmospheric conditions had allowed her to pick up a distant signal, or that an equipment malfunction had created sounds she interpreted as an emergency call. Evelyn listened to those explanations, but none of them seemed convincing. She knew what she had heard, and it had been a real person in real danger. 1 week later, Evelyn heard the transmission again. She was flying a different route, heading east toward Bettles, when the same voice came over the radio. The same desperate tone, the same plea for help, the same coordinates. This time, Evelyn immediately recognized that it was identical to the first transmission. Word for word, inflection for inflection. It was as if the same instant in time were repeating itself. She recorded the transmission with her phone, holding it close to the radio speaker. When it ended, she tried to respond again, and once again received no acknowledgement. This time she was closer to the coordinates, barely 15 miles away, so she diverted to investigate. Once again, she found nothing. During the following months, Evelyn heard the transmissions 7 more times. It always happened when she was flying through the northern region, always within a 50-mile radius of the original coordinates. Other pilots began reporting the same phenomenon. At least 5 bush pilots came forward to say they had heard the distress call and had tried to search for the source, or had reported it to the authorities. No one found anything. The transmissions always contained the same message, always gave the same coordinates, and always cut off after approximately 2 minutes. Evelyn became obsessed with understanding what was happening. She researched the history of aviation accidents in the region and discovered something unsettling. In January 1952, a bush pilot named Robert McKinley disappeared while flying from Kotzebue to Noatak. His plane, a Piper Super Cub, was never found despite extensive searches. McKinley was an experienced pilot, highly respected by the community, and his disappearance had been a great tragedy. The search records indicated that crews had focused on an area located approximately 20 miles north of the route, near a series of small lakes. The description matched the coordinates from the emergency transmission. Evelyn obtained a photograph of McKinley from historical archives and showed it to an elder in Kotzebue who had known him. The man described McKinley's voice and manner of speaking. When Evelyn played him the recording of the distress call, the elder turned pale. He said it sounded exactly like McKinley, down to certain specific phrases and the slight accent that indicated McKinley had grown up in the Midwest before coming to Alaska. But that seemed impossible. Radio equipment from 1952 could not still be transmitting. And even if it could, why would it broadcast the same message again and again for more than 7 decades? Evelyn turned her recordings over to the Federal Aviation Administration and to researchers at the University of Alaska who studied atmospheric phenomena. The Federal Aviation Administration confirmed receiving her report, but offered no explanation beyond suggesting equipment failure or unusual signal propagation. The university researchers were more interested and conducted their own investigation. They confirmed that several pilots had reported the same phenomenon and that the transmissions were real, not hallucinations or equipment failures. But they could not explain the source or the mechanism. One of the researchers suggested that certain Arctic atmospheric conditions might create a kind of electromagnetic recording that would replay under specific circumstances, though he admitted that this was purely theoretical and had no solid scientific basis. The story began to circulate in the small world of Alaska bush pilots. Some dismissed it as a ghost story. Others considered it a hoax, but many took it seriously because they knew the pilots who had heard the transmissions and trusted their professionalism. Evelyn found herself at the center of something that made her deeply uncomfortable. She was a practical person, trained in the hard realities of aviation and wilderness survival. She did not believe in the supernatural, but she also could not deny what she and others had experienced. In August 2024, a group of researchers and volunteers conducted a ground search in the area around the coordinates. They used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and drones equipped with cameras. They searched for 2 weeks across difficult terrain. On the 13th day, they found wreckage. It was buried in a depression between 2 hills, covered by decades of vegetation and accumulated soil. The wreckage belonged to a Piper Super Cub, and the tail number matched Robert McKinley's missing aircraft. Human remains were found in the cockpit, along with a radio that had been pressed into the transmitting position, as if McKinley had been calling for help at the moment he died. The discovery provided some answers, but raised many more questions. The radio had been transmitting when the crash occurred in 1952. But standard radio equipment cannot broadcast for decades without power. The plane's battery would have died within days or weeks at most. Still, several pilots had heard transmissions that seemed to originate from that location. Transmissions that matched McKinley's voice and included precise coordinates of the crash site. The experts who examined the wreckage could not explain how the radio could have continued functioning, or how the signal could have persisted for more than 70 years. Evelyn attended McKinley's funeral service in Kotzebue, where his remains were finally buried after 7 decades. The community honored him as one of the pioneering pilots who helped build Alaska's aviation network. Evelyn felt a kind of closure, though the mystery of the transmissions remained unresolved. She continued flying her routes, and from time to time she still heard the distress call over the radio. But after McKinley's burial, the transmissions became less frequent. Other pilots reported the same pattern. It was as if McKinley's message had finally been received, his location discovered, and his story completed. Evelyn does not claim to understand what happened. She knows there are phenomena in the world that science still cannot explain, and that Alaska, with its immense distances and extreme conditions, seems to generate more of those mysteries than it should. She knows the radio transmissions were real, that they led to the discovery of McKinley's crash site, and that multiple witnesses corroborated every aspect of the story. She has stopped trying to convince skeptics. Instead, she focuses on her work, transporting supplies to remote villages and watching the landscape for anything unusual. She has learned that the wilderness keeps its secrets carefully, revealing them only when it wants and in whatever way it chooses, and that sometimes the boundary between the explainable and the impossible is much thinner than anyone would like to believe. Story 5. Joseph was a 32-year-old teacher who had moved to Alaska 4 years before this incident. He had accepted a position in a predominantly native village, where he was one of only 3 non-native residents. The village, whose name he would later refuse to reveal publicly out of respect for the community, had a population of approximately 150 people and was located in the interior. It could only be accessed by boat during the summer and by snow machine or small plane during the winter. Joseph had grown up in a suburban area of Massachusetts and had studied education at the University of Vermont. He had come to Alaska in search of purpose and adventure, with a desire to make a difference in a place where good teachers were desperately needed. The first few years had been difficult, but rewarding. He learned to live without running water during the winter, to split wood for heat, and to navigate the complex social dynamics of a small community where everyone was related by blood or marriage. Joseph had worked hard to earn the village's trust. He respected the culture, attended community meetings, learned basic phrases in the local Athabaskan language, and most importantly, listened. The elders began to accept him, sharing stories and teachings that were rarely told to outsiders. Joseph felt privileged to be included, to witness traditions that stretched thousands of years into the past. He taught English, math, and science to students from kindergarten through 8th grade, and he loved his work despite the difficulties. The school was small, resources were limited, and many students dealt with problems stemming from poverty and historical trauma. But Joseph believed he was making a difference, that his presence mattered. In his 3rd year, Joseph developed a friendship with an elder named Daniel, a man in his 70s who had lived his entire life in the village and knew the land and its history intimately. Daniel was a respected storyteller and keeper of traditional knowledge. He invited Joseph to his house for tea and conversation. Over time, he began sharing stories about the old ways, about how his people had lived before contact with Europeans, about their relationship with the land and with the spirits that inhabited it. Joseph listened with sincere interest and respect, taking notes when Daniel allowed him to, and asking careful questions. Daniel seemed pleased to have someone who took his knowledge seriously, and the 2 men developed a bond that transcended their cultural differences. Daniel told Joseph about the forest people, entities that lived among the trees and could take different forms. He explained that the land was not empty wilderness, but inhabited by beings with their own territories and rules. Humans could coexist with those beings, Daniel said, but only if they showed proper respect and observed certain boundaries. There were places humans should not go, times when the forest should be left alone, protocols for hunting and fishing that were not only practical, but also spiritual. Joseph found those stories fascinating from an anthropological perspective, though he did not actually believe in the existence of supernatural entities. He saw them as cultural metaphors, ways of encoding practical survival knowledge and environmental ethics within traditional stories. Daniel seemed to sense Joseph's skepticism, but he did not confront him directly. Instead, he told him about specific places around the village that should be avoided, especially after dark. He described signs that indicated the presence of something dangerous, changes in animal behavior, unusual sounds, or the feeling of being watched. He explained that the darkness between the houses, those spaces that were not completely wild and not completely domesticated, were particularly active places, where boundaries blurred and encounters could occur. Joseph thanked Daniel for the information and promised to be respectful. but privately he thought those warnings were based on superstition and fear of the dark, not on any real danger. In October of his 4th year, Joseph made a mistake. There was a trail that ran from the village to a fishing spot on the river, about 2 miles through the forest. The path passed through an area Daniel had specifically warned him to avoid after sunset. But Joseph needed exercise and solitude, and that trail was the best place to run in the evening. He had traveled it dozens of times during the summer without incident, and he saw no reason to stop just because the nights were growing longer. He dismissed Daniel's warning as the kind of superstition that he, as an educated person, should not encourage. One Friday evening in late October, Joseph went out for a run. It was already dark by 5 in the afternoon, and the temperature was dropping below freezing. Joseph wore a headlamp and reflective clothing. He started down the trail at his usual pace, enjoying the physical effort and the silence of the forest. The path was so familiar to him that he could have traveled it with his eyes closed. Halfway to the river, right in the section Daniel had warned him about, Joseph began to feel uneasy. At first it was subtle, barely the sense that something was not quite right. The forest seemed too silent. There were no animals, no wind, only an oppressive silence closing in around the narrow beam of his headlamp. Joseph slowed to a walk, telling himself he was being irrational. There was nothing to fear. It was only a forest, only trees and darkness. Nothing more. But the feeling intensified. He felt watched, evaluated, as if something in the darkness were paying extreme attention to him. His rational mind insisted that there was no threat, but his body reacted with a primitive fear. Adrenaline flooded his system, and his heart rate rose far more than could be explained by the exercise. He stopped completely and turned around, sweeping the beam of his headlamp through the darkness. He saw nothing unusual, only trees and snow, but the feeling of presence was overwhelming. Then he heard a sound. It was not a noise he could associate with any animal he knew. It was a kind of clicking or tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from several directions. Joseph tried to locate the source, but the sound seemed to move surrounding him. He made the decision to run back to the village, abandoning his workout. When he turned to retreat, he saw something at the edge of his headlamp's beam. A tall, thin figure standing among the trees. It was there for only a fraction of a second before it vanished back into the darkness. But Joseph saw enough to know it was not human. The proportions were wrong, the movement was too fluid, and the way it disappeared was too complete. Joseph ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. The headlamp bounced chaotically with every step, and his breath came out in gasps. He felt that something was chasing him, though he did not dare look back to confirm it. The clicking followed him, sometimes close, sometimes far away, but always present. He reached the edge of the village and did not stop until he was inside his small house, with the door locked. He stood in the kitchen, trembling, trying to convince himself that he had panicked over nothing, that the darkness and isolation had triggered an anxiety response, that everything he had experienced had a rational explanation. But over the following days, strange things began happening inside Joseph's house. Small objects appeared moved or rearranged. He would leave his keys on the table and later find them on a windowsill. He would organize papers on his desk and when he returned, find them scattered. His dog, a calm and friendly husky mix, began behaving strangely, refusing to enter certain rooms, whining at the windows, and waking Joseph at night with low growls aimed at empty corners. Joseph tried to rationalize those events. Maybe he was more forgetful than he thought. Maybe the dog was reacting to sounds or smells he could not perceive. But he could not shake the feeling that there was something in his house, something that should not be there. He also began to feel watched inside his own home, the same oppressive sense of presence he had experienced on the trail. At night, he lay awake listening to sounds that could have been the house settling or could have been something moving through the rooms. He felt as if he were losing his mind, as if the isolation and darkness were eroding his sanity. He considered leaving, taking a flight to Fairbanks to rest, but he did not want to abandon his students or admit that he could not handle life in the village. Daniel noticed that something was wrong. He asked Joseph if everything was all right, and Joseph, desperate for help, told him what had happened on the trail and what was happening in his house. Daniel's expression grew serious. He told him that he had ignored the warnings and had shown disrespect by entering that area without the proper preparation or permission. He explained that what Joseph had encountered on the trail had followed him home, that the boundary between Joseph's space and its space had been violated, and that now there was an imbalance that needed to be corrected. Daniel spoke with other elders, and they all agreed to help Joseph. They would not explain exactly what they were going to do, saying only that it was traditional knowledge outsiders were not meant to possess. They came to Joseph's house on a Saturday morning, 3 elders, including Daniel. They spent several hours there. Joseph was asked to wait outside. He sat on the porch in the cold November air, wondering what was happening inside his home. He could hear singing or praying, smell smoke that did not come from his wood stove, and sense an activity he was not allowed to be part of. When the elders came out, Daniel told Joseph they had addressed the situation, that they had shown the proper respect and asked for the imbalance to be corrected. He also told him that Joseph had to show respect by following certain rules. He must never run that trail again after dark. He had to leave offerings in specific places around the village. He had to verbally acknowledge that he shared the land with beings beyond his understanding. Joseph, humbled and frightened, agreed to everything. That night, Joseph experienced something that would fundamentally change his view of the world. He woke around 3 in the morning and found his room filled with a presence so powerful and undeniable that his skepticism broke completely. He could not see anything clearly in the darkness, but he knew with absolute certainty that he was not alone. Something was there with him, something conscious and intelligent. He did not feel threatened, but he did feel judgment, evaluation, the feeling of being measured. Then he heard a voice, not in his ears, but in his mind. It spoke words he could not fully understand, but they conveyed a clear message. He was allowed to stay, but only if he remembered that he was a guest, that the land did not belong to him, that there were rules older than human civilization, and that respect was not optional, but necessary for survival. The presence faded, and Joseph remained in bed until dawn, too shaken to move. When morning came, he noticed that the oppressive feeling in his house had disappeared. The dog was calm, sleeping peacefully. The air felt normal, ordinary, as if nothing strange had ever happened. But Joseph had changed. He went to Daniel's house and thanked him with tears in his eyes, admitting that he had not truly believed and apologizing for his arrogance. Daniel accepted the apology and told him that most outsiders spent their entire lives without truly understanding. Joseph should consider himself fortunate to have learned before suffering serious harm. Joseph still teaches in the village, now in his 8th year there. He has become more integrated into the community, more humble in the way he approaches things, and more willing to accept that his education and scientific worldview do not encompass all of reality. He follows the rules the elders taught him, leaves the offerings as instructed, and never again runs that trail after dark. He has not had another direct encounter with the presence in the forest, but he knows it is there always, in the darkness between the houses and in the wild spaces beyond the village. His students sometimes ask him if he believes in the old stories, and he answers them honestly that he does. He tells them he has learned there are more things in the world than any university ever taught him, and that the wisdom of the elders is earned through generations of experience living in relationship with a land that demands respect. The experience fundamentally transformed who Joseph was and what he believed about reality. It taught him that dismissing traditional knowledge as superstition was not a sign of enlightenment, but of ignorance, and that true education requires humility before mysteries that science still cannot explain. Story 6. Scarlett recently discovered information about someone from her past that left her completely shaken. She decided to document what happened so she could process it, and also to warn others about how danger can hide in plain sight, wearing the most ordinary faces. Before beginning, Scarlett is currently 29 years old and works as a historical researcher, specializing in oral histories of rural communities. She wants to apologize if this account seems to focus too much on details and not enough on emotions, but clinical documentation is her defense mechanism against trauma. This story mentions murders, though it will not go into graphic detail out of respect for the victims and their families. Please understand that what follows is real, verified through public records and news reports, and far more disturbing than any fiction she could imagine. When Scarlett was 24 years old, she moved to a small coastal town in Alaska to conduct graduate research as part of her master's degree in anthropology. The town, which she will call Solovia for the purposes of this account, though that is not its real name, had a population of around 250 people and was only accessible by boat or plane. Scarlett's research focused on documenting the oral histories of fishing families who had lived in the area for several generations. She was interested in understanding how those communities had adapted to drastic changes in the fishing industry over the last century, how they maintained their cultural identity in the face of economic pressures and depopulation, and how they passed their knowledge of the marine environment from one generation to the next. Scarlett rented a small apartment above the general store and spent her days interviewing lifelong residents, recording their stories, and organizing the material for her thesis. At first, the community viewed her with suspicion, as often happens with rural Alaskans when outsiders arrive asking too many questions. But over time, people began to trust her. She was respectful. She listened carefully. She did not sensationalize or romanticize their lives, and she genuinely cared about preserving their stories. She attended community meetings, helped with the salmon barbecue fundraiser, and made herself useful in small ways that demonstrated commitment instead of simply extracting information for academic purposes. One of the families Scarlett became closest to was the Anderson family. Tom Anderson was in his 60s and was a retired fisherman who had spent his entire life working the waters around Solovia. His wife, Sarah, was a few years younger and had grown up in Anchorage, but had lived in Solovia since marrying Tom 40 years earlier. They had 3 adult children, all of whom had moved away for work, though they visited regularly. The Andersons were warm and hospitable. They invited Scarlett to dinner at their home and included her in gatherings during the holidays. Tom had an encyclopedic knowledge of local history and was a natural storyteller, which made him an ideal subject for Scarlett's research during the 2 years of her fieldwork. Scarlett recorded more than 30 hours of interviews with Tom, covering topics that ranged from fishing techniques to family stories and environmental changes he had witnessed over decades. Sarah was just as generous, sharing family photographs and documents that gave context to Tom's stories. Their home was full of objects connected to a life lived in relationship with the sea. Nets and fishing tools, photographs of boats and catches, family keepsakes accumulated across generations. Scarlett felt privileged to be welcomed into their lives, and she came to see the Andersons not only as research subjects, but as friends. They treated her like part of the family. They worried about her during storms, invited her on boat rides, and included her in private family events. Scarlett had become distant from her own family because of conflicts related to her career choices, and the Andersons filled a void she had not realized was so deep. During Christmas of Scarlett's second year in Solovia, the Andersons hosted a gathering at their home. Their children and grandchildren were visiting, along with extended family and friends. Scarlett was invited and felt honored to be included in such an intimate family occasion. It was at that gathering that she met Tom's brother, a man named Raymond, who lived in a remote cabin about 15 miles up the coast. Raymond was nearly 60 years old, tall, weathered, and had the kind of silence that belongs to someone who lives alone in the wilderness. He visited the town irregularly for supplies, but was largely a hermit who existed on the margins of the community. Tom introduced Scarlett to Raymond with obvious affection, explaining that his brother had chosen a solitary life, but that he was a skilled hunter and fisherman who lived completely off the land. Raymond shook Scarlett's hand with a firm, though not aggressive, grip, and they exchanged a few polite words. Scarlett asked if she might interview him sometime about his subsistence lifestyle, thinking his perspective would add depth to her research. Raymond seemed flattered by the interest and told her she was welcome to visit his cabin whenever she wanted, as long as Tom could take her by boat if the weather allowed. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, with Raymond occasionally adding comments to conversations. though most of the time he remained watching silently from the edge of the room. During the following months, Scarlett visited Raymond's cabin on 2 occasions, accompanied by Tom. The cabin was primitive but functional, situated above a rocky beach with a stunning view of the mountains across the water. Raymond showed her his smokehouse, his food cache raised on posts to protect it from bears, and his garden, where he grew vegetables during the short summer. He explained his routines and his relationship with the land in simple, direct language. Scarlett recorded those conversations and considered them valuable contributions to her research. Raymond seemed like a man who had rejected modern complexity in favor of self-sufficiency and solitude. There was nothing in his behavior or environment that Scarlett found threatening or unusual, beyond the isolation he had chosen for himself. Scarlett finished her fieldwork in the spring and defended her thesis that summer. She graduated and accepted a position at a museum in Seattle, returning to the continental United States and entering a new stage of her career. She stayed in touch with the Andersons through occasional emails and phone calls, though the intensity of the relationship naturally diminished with the distance. She remembered her time in Solovia fondly as a period of growth and discovery, the beginning of her professional life. She had no particular reason to think about Raymond, since he had been a minor character within the broader narrative of her research. 4 years passed. Scarlett was 28 years old and already established in her museum job, curating exhibitions and continuing oral history projects in different communities. One morning, she received an email from a fellow anthropologist who had heard about her work in Solovia. The colleague sent her a link to a news article with a brief message asking whether Scarlett had known the man mentioned in the story. Scarlett opened the link and felt her stomach drop as she read the headline. Raymond Anderson had been arrested for the murder of 2 women whose remains had been discovered on his remote property. The article provided details that made Scarlett's hands tremble. The Alaska State Troopers had received a tip from a pilot who had seen suspicious disturbances on Raymond's property while flying over the area. A search warrant was executed, and investigators discovered human remains buried in several locations around the cabin. Forensic analysis identified the remains as belonging to 2 women who had been reported missing years earlier. One was from Anchorage and the other from a village on the Kenai Peninsula. Both women had been traveling alone or hitchhiking when they disappeared. The evidence suggested they had been held captive for certain periods before being killed. Raymond was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Scarlett sat in her office reading and rereading the article, trying to reconcile the man she had known with the monster described in the news. She had been alone with Raymond. She had sat in his cabin recording his voice. She had walked across his property while he showed her his subsistence systems. She remembered his hands, the same hands that had shaken hers and had apparently committed acts of unspeakable violence. She thought about Tom and Sarah, about the shock and horror they must have been experiencing, about how their family was being destroyed by that revelation. She wanted to reach out to them, but she did not know what to say. She could not imagine words that would be enough. The trial happened the following year. Scarlett followed the news coverage obsessively, learning details she wished she could forget. Raymond had lured both women to his cabin under the pretense of offering help or work. The isolation of his location meant no one heard their screams, that their deaths were slow and cruel, and that Raymond had lived for years with their bodies buried around his property without showing any outward sign of guilt. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter as part of a plea agreement, claiming that the deaths had not been premeditated, but had resulted from situations that had gotten out of control. The victims' families protested the reduced charges, but the prosecution accepted the deal to avoid the trauma of a trial. Raymond was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Scarlett attended the sentencing hearing by video conference, watching Raymond as he stood before the judge. He looked older, diminished, no longer like the self-sufficient hermit, but like a shrunken figure inside prison clothing. He made a brief statement apologizing to the families but offered no real explanation for his actions. Scarlett felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger toward Raymond, grief for the victims, guilt over her own inability to see signs that must have been there, and a deep sadness for Tom and Sarah, who had lost their brother to a moral abyss whose existence they had never suspected. In 2024, Scarlett learned through news reports that Raymond had been released early because of prison overcrowding and good behavior. He had served only 15 years of his sentence. 3 months after his release, another woman disappeared in a remote area of Alaska. Her body was discovered 6 weeks later, and evidence connected Raymond to her death. He was arrested again and charged with second-degree murder. This time there would be no plea agreement. The prosecution was determined to make sure Raymond would never be released again. Scarlett cannot stop thinking about the victims. She researched their lives and discovered that they were ordinary women trying to get through difficult circumstances. One had been a mother escaping an abusive relationship. The other was a college student working temporary jobs to pay for school. They had trusted Raymond's offers of help because he seemed like a kind older man living a simple life. Their trust was betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable. Scarlett wondered how many other women Raymond had approached who rejected his offers, or how many had escaped by luck more than judgment. She also thinks constantly about her own vulnerability. She had been alone with Raymond several times in a place where no one could have helped her if he had decided to hurt her. She had trusted him because Tom trusted him, because he seemed gentle and harmless, because she could not imagine that someone capable of such evil could maintain such a convincing facade. She wonders what would have happened if she had been alone in her car and Raymond had offered help with a flat tire, or if she had gotten lost while walking and ended up finding his cabin. Would she have become another set of remains buried in the forest? The experience changed the way Scarlett sees the world and the way she conducts her research. She is now more cautious, more aware that danger can wear any face, that isolation and trust can be used as weapons by predators, and that the Alaskan wilderness offers perfect cover for those who prey on the vulnerable. She has tried to contact Tom and Sarah but has received no response, and she understands their need for distance. The last she heard was that they left Solovia, unable to remain in a place now associated with such horror. Scarlett continues her work documenting oral histories and preserving cultural knowledge, but she carries with her the certainty that she met evil wearing the mask of the ordinary, that she sat across from a killer and saw nothing more than a quiet man living close to the land. She learned that some people are extremely skilled at hiding their true nature, that charisma and trust can be tools of manipulation, and that she cannot allow herself to forget the women who were not as fortunate as she was, the women who never left Raymond's cabin alive. Story 7. This happened to Owen when he was around 19 years old. Owen, who is now 24, used to be much more trusting when he was younger and attended a satellite campus of the University of Alaska, located in a town of 600 people. The campus was part of a system designed to bring higher education to remote communities, offering associate degrees and certification programs to students who could not afford to move to Anchorage or Fairbanks. Owen was studying natural resource management and planned to work for the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management after graduating. He loved the atmosphere of the small campus, where everyone knew one another, and classes felt more like conversations than lectures. The program was close-knit by necessity, with only about 40 students in total and perhaps a dozen in Owen's cohort. They studied together, socialized together, and looked out for one another in a way that felt more like a family than an educational institution. Owen described his small college program and the close group of classmates who had all started together the year before. Most were from Alaska, with a few from the continental United States looking for adventure and a different kind of college experience. They spent long hours in the field learning surveying techniques, plant identification, wildlife management protocols, and wilderness first aid. The instructors were professionals who had spent decades working in Alaska, and they taught practical skills as much as theory. Owen loved the work and felt he had finally found his path in life. His friend group consisted of about 6 people who did everything together, studying in the small library, eating at the only restaurant in town, and organizing weekend trips into the backcountry. In January of Owen's second year, a new student transferred into the program. His name was Carter, and he said he had been attending the Anchorage campus but wanted a smaller, more personal learning environment. That was not unusual, since students sometimes transferred between campuses. though it was more common to move from a small campus to a large one than the other way around. Carter seemed eager to fit in. He asked questions about the program, expressed enthusiasm for the coursework, and sought social connections with his new classmates. He was roughly Owen's age, maybe a little older, with an easy smile and a friendly attitude that made people feel comfortable around him. Carter inserted himself into Owen's life with remarkable speed. Within a few days of arriving, he was already sitting with Owen's friend group during meals, joining their study sessions, and accompanying them in their activities. At first, Owen did not think much of it, assuming Carter was simply trying to integrate quickly into the community. But over the following weeks, Owen began to notice that Carter seemed particularly focused on him. He sat next to him in class, sought him out for one-on-one conversations, and demonstrated knowledge about Owen's schedule and habits that felt strangely detailed. Carter mentioned things about Owen's routine that Owen did not remember telling him, like where he usually went for coffee in the morning or what time he normally finished his assignments at night. In February, the program organized a weekend field research trip to study winter ecology in a remote area about 30 miles from campus. The students would work in pairs, and Carter immediately paired himself with Owen before Owen could pair up with his usual friends. They would be camping in the wilderness, collecting data on snow depth, animal tracks, and vegetation distribution. Owen felt slightly uncomfortable with the assigned partnership, but he did not want to seem unfriendly, so he accepted. During the planning meetings, Carter suggested several times that he and Owen should go to areas farther away from the main group, claiming the data would be more valuable if it came from less studied locations. The instructors rejected those suggestions, insisting on the importance of the buddy system and keeping pairs within communication range of one another. The week before the field trip, Owen discovered something disturbing. One night he was working late in the campus computer lab and needed to log into his student account from a computer different from the one he normally used. When he sat down, he noticed that someone had recently accessed the student information system and had not properly logged out. The screen showed student files including personal information such as addresses, phone numbers, and emergency contacts. Owen realized with horror that his own file was open on the screen. He checked the browsing history and saw that Carter's account had been used to access not only his information, but also the records of several other students. Owen reported the incident to the campus technology administrator the following morning, explaining what he had found. The administrator confirmed that Carter had accessed student files he should not have had permission to view. When confronted, Carter claimed he had been trying to create a student directory as a community-building project, and that he had accidentally used administrator credentials he found written on a note. He apologized repeatedly and said he would delete all the information he had collected. The administrator was skeptical, but had limited options in such a small campus environment. Carter received a warning and was told that any further violation would result in suspension. Owen directly asked Carter to explain why he had specifically accessed his personal information. Carter became defensive, saying it had been random, that he had been reviewing many student records for his directory project. But Owen had seen the screen, had seen his own name highlighted there, and he did not believe that explanation. He told Carter that his behavior made him uncomfortable and that he wanted to maintain some distance. Carter's friendly attitude evaporated, replaced by a coldness that startled Owen. Carter said Owen was overreacting, that they were friends, and that Owen should be grateful someone was making the effort to include him in things. The implication seemed to be that Owen had no right to set boundaries. The field research trip went ahead as planned, but Owen managed to switch partners at the last moment, claiming he needed to work with a student who had complementary skills for his research project. Carter was clearly furious about it and refused to speak to Owen for the rest of the weekend. Other students noticed the tension and asked Owen what had happened. When Owen explained the access to the records and Carter's strange focus on him, one of his friends made an alarming revelation. None of them had known Carter before he appeared at their table saying he was a new transfer student. Everyone had assumed someone else in the group had invited him or that another student had introduced him. But when they compared what they knew, they realized Carter had simply appeared one day and inserted himself into their friend group without having any real connection to any of them. Owen went to the program director and requested information about Carter's transfer. The director checked the records and confirmed that Carter had indeed transferred from the Anchorage campus. But when they called the Anchorage campus to request his academic records, they discovered inconsistencies. Carter had been enrolled in Anchorage, but he had been asked to leave the program because of behavioral problems related to an inappropriate fixation on another student. The Anchorage campus had not communicated this to the satellite campus when processing the transfer, an administrative failure that put Owen at risk. The program director called Carter into a meeting and informed him that his enrollment was under review. Carter became agitated, accused Owen of sabotaging him, said Owen was jealous of his abilities, and insisted that he had every right to be in the program. The meeting ended with Carter being placed on immediate administrative leave while a full investigation was conducted. He was banned from campus and ordered to return to Anchorage, but Carter did not leave town. During the following week, Owen began seeing him around the small community. Carter was standing outside the library when Owen left. He was in the cafe when Owen arrived in the morning. One night, Owen saw him standing in the parking lot across from his apartment building, simply staring at the windows. Owen called campus security, which in a town of 600 people meant calling the only police officer who covered the entire area. The officer spoke with Carter and told him to leave Owen alone, but the legal options were limited without an explicit threat or physical contact. Owen's friends came together to protect him. They made sure he was never alone, walked him to and from classes, and stayed with him in his apartment. They discovered that Carter had been researching the remote areas where the program conducted fieldwork, focusing on isolated locations where students often went in small groups. The implication was chilling. If Carter had succeeded in getting Owen alone in a remote wilderness location, there would have been many opportunities for something terrible to happen, and the isolation would have made it easy to frame anything as an accident. One of the instructors, a man who had worked in Alaska for 30 years and had a background in law enforcement, took the situation very seriously. He contacted the Alaska State Troopers and provided them with all the information about Carter's behavior, his access to student records, his fixation on Owen, and his refusal to leave town after being removed from the program. The trooper investigated and discovered that Carter had a history of similar behavior at 3 other institutions in Alaska and Washington state. He would enroll in programs with small, close-knit communities, become obsessed with a specific student, obtain access to their personal information, and try to create situations where he could isolate them. He had never been convicted of any crime, but he had repeatedly been asked to leave programs, and 2 of his previous targets had filed restraining orders against him. The trooper obtained a restraining order on Owen's behalf and made it clear to Carter that any further contact would result in arrest. Carter finally left the area, and Owen later learned that he had been admitted to a psychiatric facility after making threats against staff at his next destination. The experience left Owen shaken and distrustful. He was no longer the trusting person he had been before. He finished his degree but transferred to the Fairbanks campus for his final year, unable to feel safe in the small town where Carter had stalked him. Owen is now 24 years old and works as a surveyor for a natural resources company based in Anchorage. His job takes him to remote areas across Alaska, and he has become hyper-vigilant about safety and situational awareness. He researches every person he works with, maintains strict boundaries with acquaintances, and never allows himself to be alone in an isolated place with someone he does not know well. He learned that small communities, though usually safe and supportive, can also become traps when a predator enters them. The trust that binds people together in harsh environments can be exploited by those who know how to imitate reliability. Owen has tried to warn other students about the patterns Carter showed, sharing his story in online forums and safety workshops, hoping others will recognize the warning signs before they find themselves in danger. He learned that predators are not always strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes they are people who seem normal and friendly, who know how to insert themselves into communities, who carefully study their targets, and who use isolation as a weapon. He blocked the email accounts Carter created years later while trying to re-establish contact, and he has accepted that he will never again feel completely safe in remote places, that a part of him will always be looking for threats. always aware that danger can come from unexpected sources in places where help is too far away.